Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading, then we examine a single relevant question this passage points us to. Today I'm joined by Chris Rexroad, and we're going to be looking at a passage from Mark chapter 3. The theme we're going to use this week is what will we do with Jesus? And today what we're going to talk about is the different reactions that come when we meet Jesus or are confronted with Jesus. So the Gospel of Mark has long been noted by scholars as this book of action, calls us to action. It has often been observed that the Greek word euthus, translated as straightway or immediately, is used 42 times in this gospel. It gives this sense of movement and action to the gospel. Jesus is pictured as a man of action, rapidly moving from place to place, always healing and teaching and ministering. Mark records only 4 of Jesus' parables, but notes 19 different miracles, 2 of which are unique only to this gospel: the healing of the deaf and the dumb and man in chapter 7, and then the healing of the blind man in chapter 8. The ratio is different than the other gospels, which record more of Jesus' teaching than Jesus' miracles. Mark's emphasis on Jesus' actions is not intended to minimize his teaching. Mark uses Jesus' miracles as preparations for and demonstrations of his powerful preaching. In fact, the Greek word for teaching, didache, occurs more times in Mark than any of the other Gospels. In the early part of Jesus' ministry, we find that people had many different reactions to Jesus. So the crowds, let's talk about how the crowds reacted. They spread news about him in verse 8. While this reaction is not necessarily negative, it could be interpreted as shallow. Clearly, the crowds are spreading the news because Jesus' miracles are amazing. But this does not necessarily imply that the people were all believers in his message. Verse 8 also says many came to see him. There were many that came to see him in order to witness these amazing miracles that he's doing. But there are also many that came to him because they were terribly sick and diseased and were hoping that Jesus would heal them. Still, no commitment is implied in this action. There are many people today who react to Jesus in a shallow, self-centered way. Many people enjoy hype, crowds, the spectacular, but fewer are the people who are truly believers in Jesus and in what he taught. The demonic spirits also responded to Jesus or reacted to Jesus. The demonic spirits would cry out whenever they saw Jesus. They would shriek, "You are the Son of God." You can see this in verse 11. Although this is a true statement, Jesus would not permit his reputation to be associated with or confirmed by demonic spirits. Satan's kingdom knows who Jesus is. Our modern society has a tendency to assume that the idea of demonic possession is archaic, or that this is a superstition of ignorant cultures. But Scripture is quite clear that there is such a thing as demonic possession, and Jesus Christ has authority over all unclean spirits. There's a group of people also that are identified by the terms enemies, verse 2, critics in verse 4, Pharisees in verse 6, and verse 22, teachers of the religious law. Note how they reacted. They met the supporters of Herod and formed this plot to kill Jesus. You see this in verse 6. This radical reaction was described as the result of the hardness of their hearts in verse 5. Verse 22, they say he's possessed by Satan. In an ironic accusation, they also claim that Jesus was able to cast out devils by the power of Satan because he himself was possessed by Satan. Seems odd, right? Jesus pointed out how contradictory this logic was. It's also frequently noted that the people who often have the most difficult time with Jesus are those who are steeped in religious tradition and are in love with their positions in their organizations. And then lastly, one of the most shocking observations is how Jesus is treated by his own family. When the crowds began to gather, his immediate family became concerned, even to the point of wondering whether Jesus was out of his mind, verse 21. This highlights how humble and ordinary Jesus must have been in his daily life prior to his ministry. He didn't walk around as a teenager acting arrogantly or superior to his siblings or family members. He came to serve. So much so that as he revealed himself to be the Messiah and the Son of God, it was hard for his own family to accept that. It's also amazing how physically close we can be to God and miss his work because It's not spectacular enough. God moves and lives in the ordinary, not just the spectacular. In verse 21 and 31, it says they even tried to take him away from the people. The 12 apostles also had this reaction, had a reaction. The passage records how Jesus called his 12 apostles after he prayed, and their reactions became symbols to us of how we should respond. They came in verse 13, when Jesus beckons, the only proper response is to come to him. In verse 14, they accompanied him. Jesus is not just interested in his apostles coming to him for a moment. People that are most affected by Jesus are those who stay with him for more than a moment. They were sent out in verse 14. These people are not called just to stay by Jesus' side. Jesus calls, trains, and then sends them out. And then the last one I want to talk about is how the man with the withered hand, he reacted. We also find this great example of obedience in the opening scene of this chapter. The man whose hand was withered was in the synagogue, and Jesus calls him out in front of everybody and he heals him. He came and stood before Jesus and everybody else in verse 3. And Jesus is going to do this very public miracle here. Many times Jesus intends for a person to be noticed by others because of the work that he is doing in that person's life. Jesus is glorified in how he works in an individual's life. So in verse 5, we find that he holds out his hand. Perhaps the man was self-conscious about his deformity. It's ironic that Jesus asked the man to hold out the part of his body that was his weakest attribute. Jesus will often demonstrate his grace through a person's greatest weakness. So, Chris, let's look at a question or two. We can draw practical applications from all of these various reactions, but why do you think the person of Jesus causes such different reactions, even in our culture today?
In our culture today, I mean, people don't want things defined for them. They want flexibility. They want to define and have things acceptable in the way that they choose. And Jesus, sets some pretty big things in stone, and also sets expectations for people. And I think that causes a lot of people to kind of get up in arms about it. In the way that culture has drifted, it contrasts what certain groups of people think are acceptable and aren't. And then even for some Christians, we talk about this, that unfortunately there's a difference between a Christian and a disciple. You would like to think that it would be one and the same, but there's a lot of people that claim Christianity but don't really do much of the following part.
On a follow-up to that, do you believe people can be Christians and continue not being a disciple?
I wouldn't want to be them when they meet God and God determines whether he sees his son in them, considering what was sacrificed for them. I think that he'll judge each person independently, like somebody that accepts Jesus, not far before they die. I totally believe that God's going to have a different measuring system because of circumstances. But for somebody that claims Christianity and really does nothing with it most of their life, my answer on that would be no.
Can you think of a time when God used one of your greatest weaknesses in your life to demonstrate grace, maybe to show something to other people?
Probably one of the hardest times in my life. I went through divorce, and that's always unfortunate, but at the same time, I was beginning to pursue ministry. And I was about ready to start college and go down that path, and I'd already invested myself quite a bit in ministry where I was volunteering quite a bit, and I had my heart set on that because I felt God pulling me for several years into that. And then when divorce happened, in my mind, I'm just like, well, there goes ministry. I mean, like, who's going to hire a divorced minister? But I was reassured through my pastor and my elder because they walked through it with me. They knew the circumstances and knew that I was trying to reconcile it and everything. And but anyways, moving forward in ministry, there's a lot of people that I'm able to connect with and understand, and they'll open up to me because I do understand, because I've been through stuff like that, and I'm able to help people in different ways with that.
Right.
But it was a very, no matter what side you're on, it's a very humbling experience.
My greatest failures are typically the place that I feel the most gifted to help people.
Mhm.
Places that I have walked and struggled and know I I can think back to sermon series that I've preached and that I was able to talk about my own struggles and my own weaknesses. I think one of the things that we're afraid of is allowing people to see our weaknesses.
Mhm.
Um, I recall a number of years ago hearing a preacher preach about Jesus and Thomas. And Thomas wanted to see the scars, that Jesus had.
Mhm.
And sometimes it is our scars that is the convincing thing for people
Yeah.
to be able to know Jesus. And, I think there are so many varied responses um, from the world because Jesus creates those responses in people. But when we show that we can have the right response in spite of our flaws and in spite of our failures, I think that's a powerful thing for people to recognize. Um, how what is the most common way that you see people respond to Jesus?
Intrigued and inquisitive, if we're talking about non-believers or people that it's their first time really hearing about it. But I think it really has to do with how he's represented or presented. If it's from a church that has a very radical platform, it can be very off-putting. If it's from a church or a person that is fairly shallow in their faith, they might be kind of like, well, what's the purpose of doing all this if your life and my life pretty much look the same anyways?
Yeah, I do think how we present it matters. I think our response to Jesus has a great impact on how other people respond to
Yeah,
Jesus.
absolutely.
Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation from the book of Mark.